Well, it didn't take very long for the Atlanta Falcons to get in on the trade deadline extravaganza. Here to break it all down, Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons on X at Locked On Falcons. Now, Aaron, usually you and I are talking because our two teams are battling one another, but right now all eyes are on the Falcons. A big trade for Kentavius Street, but also kind of counteracting that, a big loss with Grady Jarrett. How does this impact what the Atlanta Falcons are doing moving forward to the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think the Falcons were probably already in the market to get some D tackle depth just because they've kind of been overusing Grady Jarrett and your boy David Onyemata this year as part of their D tackle rotation, and finding another body in there that could keep those guys rested as the Falcons try to make their playoff push in the latter half of the season so that they can still be playing strong football was already on the docket. And then you couple that now with losing Grady Jarrett for the season with the ACL tear, and that made that hole at the D tackle position even more glaring, where you're not just looking for a backup to keep those guys fresh, you're now potentially looking for a starter. And the blow to Grady Jarrett is one that they're not going to be easily able to replace on the football field. He's kind of the heart and soul of not only this defense, but the team. When David Onyemata and Calais Campbell, two sort of very effective and very prolific veterans, came into the building for the Falcons, they said, hey, this is Grady Jarrett's team. You're not going to have that leadership in the locker room. You're not going to have that production on the football field. And at least you think with Kentavius Street, maybe you stop the bleeding a little bit, but that's going to be a devastating blow that the Falcons have to work to overcome as they continue to try to make a potential playoff push in the latter half of the 2023 season.
Yeah, let's stick with that for a second, kind of trying to make up for the loss of Grady Jarrett. You mentioned Kentavius Street doesn't necessarily fill that entire gap. Could we see more movement at this position for the Atlanta Falcons by chance?
I think the Falcons are going to be standing pat probably at D tackle, although I would love to see more moves along this defensive line, possibly at edge as well, just kind of as a reshuffle, right? They've been playing Calais Campbell a lot at the DN spot this season. I think now they'll be counting on not only Street, but possibly Calais Campbell getting more of those D tackle snaps moving forward. They've liked what they've gotten from recent practice squad elevation. Laquale London, the last couple of weeks, he's been the kind of the primary guy spelling both Onyemata and Jarrett the last couple of weeks. He's getting them decent production in that role. So I think the Falcons internally believe that they have some young pieces that they can continue to get time on the field to help fill that void. But, you know, in terms of another big splash at the D tackle position, I'm not sure that's probably on the docket, but certainly would not be complaining for the Falcons adding more D-line help. Any Falcon fan out there knows they've been complaining about this team not having a good pass rush and not getting Grady Jarrett enough help for the last several years. And so adding more help would not be something that they would complain about.
Yeah, and Ryan Nielsen there in his first year as the Falcons defensive coordinator, former defensive line coach, has some familiarity with guys like David Onyemata and, of course, Caden Ellis, who went over across the division. Now he brings in another guy that he's familiar with in Kentavius Street. How much has that familiarity benefited the Atlanta Falcons defense so far this season?
I think that's going to be a big thing, and they can expect someone like Street to kind of hit the ground running, just because not only has he played for Ryan Nielsen and knows what he wants in a D lineman and in this defensive scheme from his days in New Orleans last year, but going back to his collegiate days at NC State, where he was part of a very prolific NC State defensive line that saw four guys get drafted in that 2018 draft, with Street being the fourth rounder for the 49ers. So I think you kind of expect Street to kind of hit the ground running. He'd be much more of a player that can sort of hit the ground running than someone else who's just completely coming in fresh and brand new. But so far, so good with Ryan Nielsen and what he's brought to the defense, even though they're coming off a little bit of a rough game against the Tennessee Titans where Will Levis kind of cooked them a little bit. Hopefully they can bounce back this week and get back to playing really, really good football moving forward. And obviously losing a player like Grady Jarrett is going to make that a lot harder. But I think Kentavius Street, as I said earlier, can sort of ease some of that suffering.
All right, so maybe no more moves at defensive tackle, right? Got another day here on the trade deadline before you get into really looking at what you're going to have for this weekend's game. You mentioned edge rusher. What's a name, whether edge rusher or otherwise, the Falcons fans should be paying attention to or hoping for being the newest addition in Atlanta?
Well, keeping an eye on the Washington Commanders situation. You know, Montez Sweat is the name, right? There's been various reports that the Falcons have already made an offer for Montez Sweat, and the Commanders are kind of mulling it over. Do they want to make the move? Do they want to keep Sweat? Do they want to make their own potential playoff push? You know, are they going to pay Montez Sweat? All that stuff and more. I think the Falcons would happily take Montez Sweat off the Washington Commanders plate, pay him the money that he wants as something that they can, you know, bolster that defensive line, not only for the rest of this season, but potentially have a really solid group of players for years to come, potentially when Grady Jarrett comes back next year.
Gotta love it. For more on the Atlanta Falcons, this move, Kentavius Street, and of course the ever-growing popularity of the dreaded late-round pick swap, you can find that and, of course, any additional moves that the Falcons may be looking at making over on the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Aaron, thanks so much, bud.